Good morning everyone. Before we begin today's session, I want you to look at this editorial carefully. The title reads, The US Ends Russia Oil Waiver, Implications for India. Now, if you are sitting for UPSC Mains 2026, this editorial is not background reading. This is foreground material. This could be your general studies paper 3 question. This could be your essay topic. This could show up in your interview as the very first thing the board chairman puts on the table in front of you. Why? Because this editorial sits at the intersection of 3 things UPSC loves to test: energy security, India's foreign policy, and economic vulnerability. The US has ended a waiver that allowed certain transactions involving Russian seaborne oil. For the rest of the world, this might look like another chapter in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But for India, a country that imports 90% of its crude oil and became one of the largest buyers of discounted Russian crude after 2022, this is a direct economic and strategic challenge. In the next few minutes, I am going to break this down for you the way you need to present it in your mains answer, with context, with analysis, and with India's strategic position at the center. Stay with me. Let's get into it. Today we are going to talk about something that appears in the headlines as a Europe problem or an America-Russia problem. But I want you to understand from the very first slide that this is very much an India problem. 3 numbers to remember: India imports 90% of its crude oil. It is the world's 3rd largest oil importer. And the sanctions regime we are discussing has now been running for over 3 years. These are not abstract statistics. They define India's vulnerability in a turbulent world energy market. Let's begin. Here is the structure of today's lecture. 8 chapters. We begin with the facts, what actually happened. Then we'll understand why India is directly in the firing line. Then we'll go deeper into the economic contradictions of Western sanctions, the chain reaction of energy shocks through India's economy, and the critical vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz. After that, we'll talk about how the very definition of energy security has changed, and finally, what India should actually do about all of this. By the end, you will never read a crude oil headline the same way again. Let's go. Let's start with the basics. What actually happened? The United States has tightened restrictions on Russian seaborne oil. This is part of a broader sanctions regime the West imposed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, here's what's critical to understand. This is not new. For over 3 years, the world has been attempting something extraordinarily difficult, keeping one of the planet's largest oil exporters under heavy sanctions, while simultaneously trying to keep global energy prices stable. Think about that for a moment. You are trying to punish a country by cutting off its oil revenues. But that same oil is what the rest of the world runs on. You pull too hard on one end, and the other end snaps back at you. And now that balancing act, which was always fragile, is becoming dangerously unstable. Why? Because oil markets are already under stress. There is active conflict in West Asia. Maritime trade routes are being disrupted. And there are growing concerns about the Strait of Hormuz, which we will return to in detail. Now, why is this an India story? Let me give you one number. 90%. India imports approximately 90% of its crude oil. We are the world's 3rd largest oil importer and one of the fastest growing energy consumers on the planet. Unlike Germany or Japan, where energy demand has more or less plateaued, India's demand is going to keep climbing. Because we are still industrializing. Still urbanizing. Millions of Indians are buying their first scooter, their first car. Factories are being built. Cities are expanding. So energy for India is not a luxury or a policy choice, it is the fuel of our development story. When Russian crude started flowing into India in large volumes after 2022, there was enormous criticism from the West. They called it morally questionable. They said India was supporting Russia. But here's what those critics missed: energy importing countries rarely have the luxury of ideology. India saw Russian oil not as a political statement, but as an economic stabilizer. It helped moderate inflation. It improved refinery economics. It reduced our dependence on any single region. It gave us supply flexibility at a moment of great turbulence. So when the US tightens the screws on Russian oil, it isn't just Russia that feels the pinch. India feels it too. This is where it gets really interesting. I want you to think like an economist and a strategist. What does the West want from these sanctions? Reduce Russia's oil revenues. Punish Russia economically. Low inflation at home. Stable fuel prices. Uninterrupted global energy flows. Now ask yourself, can you have all of these at the same time? The answer, increasingly, is no. Here's the logic: when you constrain one of the world's largest oil suppliers, you tighten global supply. When supply tightens, prices rise. And here's the cruel irony: when prices rise high enough, Russia actually earns more revenue, not less, even while exporting smaller volumes. So the very sanctions designed to hurt Russia can, beyond a threshold, actually help Russia's revenues while hurting everyone else, including India, through higher prices. This is why, if you've been following the news carefully, you'll have noticed that Western sanctions policy has oscillated. There have been waivers. There have been carve-outs. There have been exemptions. People called it inconsistency. But it wasn't inconsistency, it was market reality forcing pragmatism. Markets eventually force pragmatism. No government, however powerful, can indefinitely defy the physics of supply and demand. Now let me put on my economics hat and show you exactly how a disruption in global oil markets ripples through India's economy. Think of this as a chain reaction. Shock 1, higher crude oil prices. Crude gets costlier. Imports become more expensive. The rupee comes under pressure. Inflation rises. Your grocery bill goes up. Transport costs go up. Fertilizer subsidies balloon. The government's fiscal deficit widens. Shock 2, Strait of Hormuz disruption. If this critical choke point is threatened, LPG and fuel logistics get stressed. Cooking gas for millions of Indian households is directly affected. Shock 3, shipping insurance surge. War risk insurance premiums go up. The landed cost of crude rises even if the base price stays the same. Refining margins get squeezed. Refiners pass costs downstream. Shock 4, Russian crude restrictions. India loses supply flexibility. We must scramble for alternative sources. Those alternatives are typically more expensive. Higher sourcing costs across the board. Shock 5, freight disruptions. Shipping lanes become risky or congested. Cargoes get delayed. Inventory management becomes a nightmare for refiners and distributors. And here is the most important thing, these shocks do not operate in isolation. They compound each other. India, because of its high import dependence, sits squarely in the path of all five simultaneously. Let me spend a moment on something that is a major strategic vulnerability for India, the Strait of Hormuz. Take out a mental map. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. It is the single most important oil transit choke point in the world. Nearly 1/5 of all global oil trade passes through it. A large share of India's crude oil and LPG imports transit through these waters. Now, what happens if there's a military escalation in the region? What if Iran decides to threaten the strait? What if there are attacks on tankers? Suddenly, India's energy supply is directly threatened, not because of anything India did but simply because of the geography of global oil flows. This is why Russian crude, for India, became more than just cheap oil. It became a diversification mechanism, a way to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern supply routes and Hormuz-linked vulnerabilities. When you remove that option, you push India back toward a single, geopolitically exposed supply corridor. The Strait of Hormuz is India's Achilles heel. And that is not a metaphor, it is a strategic reality. Here's a conceptual shift I want every one of you to internalize, because it changes how you think about the entire problem. In the old world, energy security meant, do you have access to physical supply? Are there enough barrels in the ground? In the new world, energy security means something far more complex. You can have oil in the ground. But it might not reach you because shipping restrictions block the tanker. Insurance controls make it uninsurable. Financial sanctions mean payment systems won't process the transaction. Tanker blacklisting means no vessel will carry it. Payment barriers mean even if you want to buy, you can't transfer the money. And maritime security risks mean the tanker captain simply won't sail that route. So today, global energy is deeply entangled with financial architecture and geopolitical architecture. It is not just about crude oil. It's about SWIFT systems, insurance markets, tanker registries, and military presence in sea lanes. This is the new reality. And India's planners need to understand this new reality, not the old one. Alright. We've diagnosed the problem thoroughly. Now let's talk solutions. What does a smart, resilient energy strategy look like for India? The lecture lays out 7 pillars. Think of these not as a government checklist, but as a strategic architecture. Pillar 1, expand strategic petroleum reserves. This is your buffer. If supply gets disrupted tomorrow, how many days can India survive on stored reserves? We need to dramatically expand this capacity. It's expensive, but it's insurance. Pillar 2, diversify crude sourcing regions. Don't overdepend on any single country or region. Build relationships with suppliers across Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. Spread the risk. Pillar 3, strengthen domestic exploration. India has untapped hydrocarbon potential. Deepwater exploration, unconventional resources, we need to invest more aggressively in finding our own oil. Pillar 4, improve refining flexibility. Indian refineries need to be able to process a wider variety of crude grades so that if one supply source is cut off, we can quickly switch to another without refinery disruptions. Pillar 5, accelerate gas infrastructure. Natural gas is cleaner, often cheaper, and can substitute for oil in several sectors. Building out LNG terminals and pipeline networks gives India more fuel flexibility. Pillar 6. Expand alternative energy. Renewables, green hydrogen, nuclear, these reduce oil dependence at the macro level and are India's long-term insurance policy against fossil fuel geopolitics. Pillar 7, and this is the most important, preserve strategic autonomy. India must not become so dependent on any single geopolitical camp, Western or Eastern, that it loses the freedom to make independent energy decisions. India's approach reflects not neutrality, but realism. Let me close with the big picture. Because this is what I want you to carry out of this classroom today. We are entering a new era in global order. The world is becoming increasingly fragmented, not into one globalized system, but into competing geopolitical blocks. And energy trade is right at the center of this fragmentation. Energy is no longer governed purely by economics. It is shaped by sanctions regimes, strategic rivalries, and geopolitical alignments. If you are too dependent on one bloc economically, energetically, you become a hostage to that bloc's decisions. The years ahead will likely see repeated conflicts between geopolitical objectives and energy market stability. Sanctions, wars, maritime disruptions, and supply chain shocks may become routine, not exceptional. In that world, the countries that survive and prosper are not the most ideologically pure. They are the most resilient. And resilience, ultimately, is what India must build. And I want to leave you with the most honest sentence I've come across on this entire subject. Tankers must still move. Refineries must still operate. Economies must still function. In the end, energy systems obey physical realities, not political slogans. That is your lens for every energy headline from today onwards. 3 lines. Write them down. These are the takeaways from today's lecture. 1. Energy importing nations cannot afford ideology. They must pursue realism. 2. Modern energy security is financial and geopolitical, not just physical. 3. Diversification is not just a supply strategy, it is a sovereignty strategy. India's energy decisions in the years ahead will define not just its economic trajectory, but its strategic independence as a nation. Resilience is what India must build. And now you know exactly why. Thank you.